a Casa Árabe por la oportunidad que nos ha brindado de poder contar hoy con el profesor Behnassi para hablarnos de un tema que me parece que es fundamental, que es el cambio climático en los países árabes, sus implicaciones y las posibilidades que hay de hacerle frente. El profesor Behnassi es investigador principal y profesor de políticas sobre medio ambiente global en la Universidad de Agadir, como ha explicado Olivia, y especialista en cambio climático y medioambiental. Se formó y leyó su tesis doctoral en la Universidad de Casablanca y ha tenido diferentes estancias postdoctorales en Finlandia, en Nueva York, en la Universidad de Syracuse en Nueva York, y es autor de algunos libros recientes muy importantes sobre el tema, entre ellos el más reciente Climate Change, Food Security and Natural Resource Management en Springer 2019. Es consultor y creador de varias organizaciones que se dedican al asesoramiento, a la consultoría sobre cuestiones de clima, de cambio climático en el mundo árabe y en el Mediterráneo. Precisamente para introducir este tema, que estábamos recordando ahora que he conocido personalmente al profesor Behnassi, estábamos recordando el sistema del Tribunal de las Aguas de Valencia, como muchos sabéis, por tener un ejemplo relativamente cercano a nosotros. Era un sistema muy eficiente que sigue existiendo todavía de distribución de las aguas, ¿no? Que es una cuestión, es una herencia, es un producto de la cultura árabe y musulmana, de la estancia, de la huella que han dejado de los árabes en España, y es un sistema modélico de gestión de aguas. Bueno, era una alusión a la historia de España que hemos antes mantenido y compartido los dos, y era para reflexionar sobre que muchas de las soluciones probablemente ya se encuentran en la historia de nuestros pueblos, de nuestros países, estas soluciones que a veces son del conocimiento tradicional, como decía antes el profesor Behnassi en la conversación, son de la cultura tradicional, pueden ser respuestas que son locales, que tienen que ser necesariamente apropiadas por la comunidad, ¿no? Apropiación de las diferentes comunidades, la adaptación, ¿no?, al cambio climático. Y también, bueno, vagamente reflexionábamos también sobre el nombre de Madrid, ¿no?, Masrid, ¿no?, el agua que corre, ¿no?, la etimología árabe del nombre de Madrid y la referencia a las aguas, ¿no?, y ese sistema de canalización subterránea que había en Madrid, ¿no? Bueno, pues eso era también un sistema de gestión, de aprovechamiento del agua compartida, ¿no? Y yo creo que esos ejemplos abundan en el Mediterráneo, en la zona que compartimos, ¿no? Yo creo que quizás esta es una reflexión que debemos hacer, que el cambio climático nos afecta a todos, que muchas de las soluciones están ya, las tenemos delante, son parte de nuestra historia, de nuestra cultura común. Y bueno, evidentemente hay problemas, dificultades, amenazas que plantea el cambio climático. También creo que va a salir en la conferencia del profesor Behnassi oportunidades. El mundo árabe tiene un gran potencial de una población muy joven, muy dinámica, y que creo que va a afrontar estos problemas adecuadamente. En algunos casos puede parecer la problemática es muy urgente y hay que actuar, el tiempo no perdona, y creo que eso es un poco también lo que se quiere hacer ver aquí en esta conferencia. Sin más, le voy a dar la palabra al profesor Behnassi, le voy a agradecer que esté aquí con nosotros, que ha venido desde lejos, y bueno, pues espero que la conferencia resulte del interés de todos. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rafael, for presenting me to the audience. I'm very delighted to be here among you, and I would like to thank la Casa Árabe for inviting me to be a part of this annual program, which is very interesting, as explained by Olivia, in promoting intercultural understanding and relationships, in fostering the tolerance in an era where globalization is generating many factors for conflicts, for divergence, and for misunderstanding. So I think the work done by La Casa Árabe and the whole staff is not just with impact for Spain, but I think it's very promising for the relationship among countries in the Mediterranean region and with the northern Mediterranean and the southern Mediterranean. So I would like also to thank the president of Casa Árabe for inviting me to take part in this program, and also for your support to facilitate my stay here in Madrid, and also the logistical arrangements prior to my coming here in Madrid. So the topic I'm going to discuss about this evening is universal in nature. It's global. You know that during the last 2 decades, there are many problems and challenges facing all nations, and they are global in nature, and therefore need for their efficient management global action, while also the local level is very relevant. So climate change is a very complex with multi-dimensional both sources, causes, and implications. So it's very complicated to manage this issue, especially that the existing settings are still designed to face some local and national challenges. And this is both relevant to international law and international governance settings, and also national and local settings. But when it comes to facing climate change, especially from an adaptation point of view, the problem becomes more complicated than if it is perceived only in terms of mitigation. Because when we speak about ending climate change, we have 2 main options so far, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is to end what generates what we call greenhouse gases that cause a global warming. And this is very easy to do it because we know that the consumption of fossil fuels, deforestation, intensive agriculture and livestock, the declining capacity of carbon sequestration of the whole planet are key sources and key causes of climate change. So we can easily make an end to these different causes of climate change. But when it comes to adaptation, it's very difficult to agree about some common solutions, because adaptation is very specific to local communities, to local ecosystems, to different natural resources. Adaptation is also an area where we have to manage linkages, interrelation between environment and human societies. This is maybe the focus of this annual program this year on the adaptation issue, because it's an evolving area where complexity is the norm, but complexity shouldn't create within societies or for the actors the fear to go ahead and to take action. Okay, because adaptation covers more or less actions from a macro level perspective, and action also from a very micro level perspective. So any action that is oriented to adaptation should be esteemed and should be invested on, because the outcomes are more or less promising. So let's just have a brief introduction to this area, and to remind you of the evolving of the human-induced climate change and some dynamics related to this global problem before speaking very closely on adaptation in the Arab region. And why the Arab region? You know that since the creation of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which is linked to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, we have created this scientific authority in order to produce periodic reports, assessments aimed at facilitating the multilateral negotiations related to climate change. And from 1992 so far, the IPCC have produced many reports and assessments with a very positive outcome is the reduction of the scientific uncertainty linked to climate change. Because many countries in 1992, the Rio Summit, refused to recognize something called climate change, just because from a scientific point of view it's still uncertain. So why do we need to politically invest in an area which is still scientifically uncertain? Maybe it's not a very good investment. So the IPCC, which is composed of more than 4,000 of scientists and experts in all areas related to climate change, has produced reports and assessments that confirm the climate change is a real problem. It's not anymore uncertain, and we should do something about it. Otherwise, within the coming years, it will be very late and irreversible. Very late because even if we invest in mitigation, we fully invest in mitigation, the accumulation of greenhouse gases since the industrial period so far will generate many risks in the near future. These risks will impact both social and ecological systems in all countries worldwide. But countries are not in the same level of suffering. That means we will have some regions that will be very vulnerable to climate change, called hotspots, and other regions less vulnerable to climate change impact. So in this context, the Arab region, which is a sub-region in the MENA, the Middle East and the North Africa region, it is considered by the IPCC report as the most vulnerable region to climate change impact. It's a hotspot. That means this region should focus on climate change as a priority, not just from an environmental point of view or a social point of view or economic point of view. It should be considered like the biggest challenge to the security and development of our countries in the near future. Currently, if we speak about the impact of climate change as a future prospect, in the Arab region, climate impacts are already occurring. That means in this region, we are already suffering from climate change. It's not anymore a future perspective. So from Morocco to Egypt, to Somalia, to Sudan, to Mauritania, all these countries are suffering from climate change, and the impacts are touching everything. Economic sectors, human security, development, and even political stability. And this is maybe more or less strange for Western countries and Western population, because it's not very easy to link climate change to security in the developed world, because it's maybe in terms of perception, it's very difficult to give some robust evidence. In Arab region, it's very easy to link climate change with political security. So recently, there are many studies, research, that try to link climate change to many events happening now in the Arab region. In 2011, some studies linked climate change, links the what we call Arab Spring uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, to climate change as an indirect driver. It's very difficult to say that climate change can directly affect the security area, but studies confirms that the indirect impact is more or less evident. Let's just have an example. Prior to the uprisings in Egypt in 2011, there was a very hard drought. Okay, and this drought has negatively impacted the capacity of the country to meet the food security of the populations. And many people found themselves in the street just to claim for their right to food security, the right to bread. You can just notice among the many Rwandic social claims, many claims are linked to food security, which is a part of human security. In Tunisia, it was the same. In Sudan, the same. In many countries in the Arab region, climate change can be explained as an indirect factor behind the mass human displacement. Thousands and millions of people leave their homes, their countries, to seek human security, food security, access to natural resources in other regions, especially in Europe. So a large part of migration influx can be explained of the indirect impact of climate change. And in the future, if nothing is done to adapt with this evolving risk, the outcome will be very worrying for all countries, not just for Arab countries, but also for the neighboring regions like the EU. So facing climate change is not, by the Arab world, is not only a domestic affair. It should be an interstate affair and a key question, key issue in cooperation, international cooperation, within the Mediterranean, within the MENA, within the southern and the northern countries. Let's go back to the IPCC. According to a recent report, there is still a certain uncertainty about what constitutes safe levels of greenhouse gases emission. speaking about emissions. So in this context, which is marked by the resistance of many developed countries to take substantial, promising actions related to mitigation. In the last COP 25 in Madrid showed that it's not easy to reach certain consensus about mitigation goals or technical and financial assistance to vulnerable countries when it comes to their adaptation policies. So far, there is still a deadlock in international climate action, which is explained by the resistance of many key emitting powers like USA, China, Russia, etc., to take action domestically and to help to assist other countries in terms of adaptation. They promises to sustain the adaptation actions in the rest of the world are not met so far, and this is really very worrying. So in this context, the Arab world or the Arab region should take action. They shouldn't wait for external assistance in order to start practicing adaptation. Adaptation should be done now, or it will be very costly to do it in the future. And I recommend you a United Nations Development Program report about the cost adaptation in Arab countries, where it was mentioned clearly that unless we adapt now, in the future, the cost of adaptation will be tenfold. And maybe some situations will be irreversible. That means even if we adapt, we will not be able to produce the needed or the expected outcomes. So it's like a trap for the Arab countries. Either they should take action or they should maybe delay action. But in both cases, it's costly. Okay. Alors, we know that the Arab region was, in the past, was more or less a region which is used to a climate variability. And they had the potential to adapt to this variability and to limit, to reduce its impacts on its development, stability, security, and so on. But the pace of current climate change is extending, is overcoming the capacity of Arab countries to adapt according to past practices. So this potential is declining, and even if these countries are, for instance, investing in some other areas, for instance, energy development, agricultural development, tourism, etc., without investing in adaptation, the outcomes of all investments may be compromised in the future, because climate change will be a factor which undermines the capacity of the Arab regions to achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. It's mentioned now in many reports. Unless we face climate change, the progress toward the SDGs will not be possible. So that means all investments done in other areas will not produce the needed outcome unless we adapt to climate change. So just to give you an idea about the importance of adaptation in this region. To understand the links between climate change and human security and development in the Arab region, I'm going just to give you some areas where these linkages are very clear and evident. For instance, in terms of food security, the Arab region is the highest food deficit and among the highest food importing region in the world. That means more than 60% of food consumption are imported from other countries. And the capacity of, sorry, maybe I forget to display the, and the capacity to produce food is declining now because of many factors. But among these factors, we have the climate factor, which is the key factor. How? Climate change is affecting what we call the food production systems in the Arab region. It's affecting the water resources availability and quality in this region. It's affecting what we call the land fertility. It's affecting the capacity of societies in this region to produce food because many young people which are active live rural areas in order to be, for instance, workers in industries or to migrate to other countries, etc. So they are abandoning agriculture, and the consequence is that the food production capacity of these countries is declining, both because of social and environmental and climate factors. In terms of water security, climate change is affecting the water security in the Arab region in multiple ways. The IPCC report classified the MENA region as a region which contains 14 of the world's 20 most water-stressed countries. So more than 2/3 of countries with water stress are located in the MENA region and mostly in the Arab region. And many reports of other institutions like the World Bank clarify that this water insecurity will be also the biggest challenge for the security and development of the Arab region, because a large part of populations in this region are relying on water for agricultural development, for livelihoods, etc. So the decrease of water resource threats the security of development in this region in a profound way. And the impact will vary across the region, but in general terms, all countries will suffer in different ways. In the last 10 years, the decrease in water resources in many regions achieved more than 20%, just in 10 years. That means within the coming decades, we will not be a water deficit region just in 2050, according to IPCC scenarios. But within the coming years, we will be so in a way that differentiates this region compared to other regions which are not water deficit. In terms of economic loss, climate change will be expected to have the greatest loss related to climate impact on water security, and also the decline of agricultural development and the impact of climate change on health and livelihoods. So many sectors in the Arab region will be negatively impacted by climate change, and the contribution of these sectors to the GDP of many countries will decrease. And this is also a very negative perspective. In terms of displacement, as I mentioned before, climate change is triggering human displacement from many regions to other regions, both domestically and internationally. And this kind of movement can be considered like an adaptation strategy. But the problem is that these displacements are creating more competition on limited resources. And competition over limited resources can create conflict. So in many regions, some conflict can be indirectly linked to what we call resource shortage. So many governments in this region should be very careful in order to manage this human displacement and to keep them within a certain limit, because if we allow spontaneous displacement to many regions, it will be a new cause of political instability and conflict, and these countries can be put in a vicious cycle of insecurity and instability. So there are also some impact on human health. Many health problems in this region are linked to climate change as what we call amplifier of causes to health insecurity. Now, given this situation, which is more or less black, disappointing, what should be done to reverse these trends? I think before speaking about the needed actions to reverse these trends, I'm going just to mention some barriers to adaptation in the Arab regions. There are many barriers that can prevent the region to adapt efficiently to climate change. So we have, for instance, many institutional, financial, technological, informational, and governance also issues, bad governance issues, that can hinder the adaptation in the Arab region and prevent the needed or the expected outcomes of adaptation action. We have, for instance, challenges related to climate change, which is compounded by instability in the region. Insecurity and instability and conflict in the region are preventing the government to take the needed actions when it comes to adaptation, because they consider insecurity issues or security issues as a priority. And environmental climate issues as a second priority. So you understand now, it's a question of perception. How political leaders, how decision makers perceive the existing and current challenges. Sometimes they don't link these conflicts and security issues with environmental and climate issues. And in terms of policy making, it's like a missed opportunity. We have also the problem of unequal vulnerabilities to climate change in the region. We have, for instance, in the region some countries which are financially rich, and by their wealth, they can more or less adapt to climate change, but this is just a short-term adaptation. It's not a long-term adaptation. Okay, for instance, when we use when we overuse conditioning just to face the rise of temperature, it's a short-term adaptation. It's not long-term. But when we focus on within the construction sector on new techniques to make building, to manage the energy within this building, when we choose new materials to build, to make construction, this is a long-term adaptation strategy within the construction sector. But to use air conditioning is not affordable to everyone. In the future, when the energy is very expensive, it's very difficult to grant this access to all population. It's just an example. Unequal vulnerabilities to climate change means unequal capacities to respond. Countries with limited financial resources, limited scientific and technical capacities, insufficient governance systems will not be able to respond to climate change because there is a certain inequality. We have also a weak institutional capacity to address climate change within the region. For instance, climate change is what you call a cross-sectoral challenge. It's like a horizontal challenge. And in many Arab countries, the governance cities are still sectoral. That means we have the Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Water, Ministry of Human Rights, etc. Every ministry has its own logic, its own priorities, its own challenges. But climate change should be managed in a cross-sectoral way. So unless there are coordination mechanisms within this government, unless these governments are innovative in terms of institutional engineering, it's very difficult to face climate change in the future. Because climate change needs this collaboration, this sectoral collaboration, integrated policies, this synergy between all existing institutions. And otherwise, responses or response mechanism to climate change will not be efficient. Linked to the last barrier, we have also the predominance of linear approaches of siloed development policies which fail to tackle the complexity of climate risks. So, sectoral ministries produce sectoral policies. I give you an example from Morocco. In Morocco, we have the Ministry of Agriculture. And we have the Ministry of Tourism. And we have the more or less departments that manage water, environment, forests, etc. The Ministry of Agriculture, during the last 10 years, had what we call Morocco Green Plan, which is an agricultural strategy. And within this plan, we have focused on intensive, export-oriented agriculture without taking into consideration the water shortage, the land degradation, the extreme events negatively affecting agricultural land, etc. So unless we build synergies between the agriculture, the Ministry of Agriculture and other ministries which are using the same resource, like water, the future is not really bright for Morocco when it comes to water resource management. We have also the same problem within the Ministry of Tourism. Within this ministry, it's very difficult to find a focus on the sustainable management of water within the touristic areas or within the tourism sector. So it's like every ministry manage its sector in separate ways and in different logics. And this creates or generates many negative externalities, many new problems that should be managed. So climate change is an opportunity to rebuild the governance system within each country from this perspective, from a non-linear perspective, from a cross-sectoral perspective, from an integrated way. The Arab region is also known by its weak systematic observation and monitoring of climate variables. We rely so far on scientific evidence produced elsewhere. And this evidence is not adapted, is not taken into consideration the specific dimensions of climate risks. So when we consider this information as an input for policy making, the last outcome or the last decision or policy will not be really efficient because they are based on information data which is not very relevant. There is also poor awareness and limited perception of the severity of climate risks in many Arab countries. So this misperception or this limited perception of climate risks will give birth to decisions or policies which are not properly designed or implemented. So my last parts, because maybe of 5 minutes, okay. So what should be done from a policy making perspective? Let's keep hope, because there are many countries who are doing good when it comes to climate mitigation and adaptation. That means the Arab countries have certain reference to be seized as an opportunity. But I have to remind that adaptation should be locally designed and implemented. We can import some solutions from elsewhere, but we have to adapt it to specific circumstances. So the priority in our region when it comes to adaptation is to mainstream adaptation in policy planning or decision-making processes. I said mainstreaming climate adaptation is not creating new institutions or new ministries or complicating already complicated governance settings, but to mainstream climate change adaptation to every institution and to make climate change as a binding commitment, a binding perspective for the work of these institutions. And the sectors that should be given priority in this region are agriculture, water management, and tourism, because they are the sectors which are most vulnerable to climate risks. So we have to start with these sectors because the expected outcomes will be very positive for the other sectors, for both the social and ecological systems in this region. The second priority is to diversify agricultural policies. Why I am mentioning again agricultural sector? Because the agricultural sector in the Arab region is consuming between 80% and 90% of available water resources. So we should redesign and rethink the agricultural policies in this region in order to reduce the consumption of water resources, in order to protect the land from pollution, in order to enhance the local food security and not just to sustain in external markets, and also to reorient agriculture toward what we call climate resistant crops. That means crops which are resistant to climate change and consume less water resources and with less impact on land. The third area where investments can be also made is the integration of planning for water and energy sectors, and also the investment in renewable energy. So we know that investments in renewable energy can be what we call a co-benefit strategy. What does it mean, co-benefit strategy? Is the same piece of policy which can be designed according to both adaptation and climate mitigation goals. For instance, in many countries, such as Morocco, the new agriculture policy, which is adopted just a few days ago before this lecture, called the Generation Green 2020, it's supposed to take lessons from all mistakes done in previous agricultural strategy. In this strategy, we will focus in the future on the use of renewable energy in agriculture. And using renewable energy in agriculture will help using the last irrigation technology in the world, because this irrigation technology need a huge amount of energy consumption. There is also a link between the investment in renewable energy and water consumption. In many countries, like China and France, they start recently to reduce their investment in some types of renewable energy just because we use many water inputs, a huge amount of water inputs for cooling purposes. So we are redesigning now renewable energy sector in order to limit the use of available water resources. There's also what we call bioenergy, like corn, ethanol, which is highly subsidized in some countries like the US. And in many countries, we are starting to produce energy from waste or from agricultural residue. We value this residue and we produce energy from it. So in the Arab region, we should integrate planning for water and energy because there are some co-benefit outcomes. The last recommended action is to leverage finance from international funds to foster climate resilience in Arab states. I have included this last action, which is, in my opinion, very important, especially in the first stage of adaptation. The Arab countries don't have sufficient financial resources for adaptation purposes, except some Gulf countries. So Arab countries should benefit from existing funds, international funds, dedicated to adaptation. But these countries so far are not equipped and they don't have the needed capacities to benefit from these existing funds. The problem is that many developing countries in other regions, not the MENA, are benefiting from these funds in a robust way. And it's linked to the capacity of these countries to benefit from these funds. So I think that, for instance, the EU will be able to advocate for this, either by providing technical assistance to Arab countries in designing adaptation projects that can be funded by existing financial funds, and also to develop what we call bilateral cooperation oriented to adaptation. And let's remind you that this cooperation shouldn't be just perceived from an assistance perspective, because the EU is investing on its own development and security. Okay, the links between the EU and the Arab region or the southern Mediterranean countries are strong. There are many cultural, political, economic ties, and we shouldn't give the opportunity to climate risks to create a certain rupture, demarcation in this area, and to create like virtual walls between the EU and the Arab world, because it's not productive for the both regions. As a conclusion, I think that building resilience in Arab states, where, for instance, drought, changing rainfall patterns, and conflict are putting millions of people at risk and spiking displaced, hunger, and malnutrition numbers. We need to assess these nations and communities in building active, innovative, and bold interventions that allow them to better adapt to a changing climate. 6 out of 10 people in the Arab region are under 30 years old. That means they are young people. These youth, in my opinion, will lead the way, but they still need support from their own governments, from external governments, and also they need stronger institutions and the legitimacy to be involved in climate adaptation. We know that democracy in the Arab world is still problematic, and the lack or insufficient democracy in the Arab world is also affecting the capacity of these societies to adapt to climate change. Because adaptation needs the mobilization of all actors, state and non-state actors, citizens, communities, social movements, etc. And unless participation mechanisms are set to help these young people to access to decision-making processes, they will not be able to influence or to advocate for climate adaptation in the future. So the link between climate adaptation and democracy and human rights is very strong. It shouldn't be really, what we say?
Forgotten also.
Yes, yes. The last point is that there are many frameworks set by United Nations, especially, which can be considered like an opportunity for the Arab state to face climate risks. We have, for instance, the Sustainable Development Agenda, which we call SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. We have the Paris Agreement, and we have the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. In these three frameworks, there are many provisions for developing countries. We consider developing countries like a very particular group that should be assisted to foster its development, to foster its climate resilience, and to build its capacity to manage disaster. So Arab countries should benefit from these frameworks, and they should also develop regional cooperation in order to take transversal and transboundary actions susceptible of fostering climate resilience in the future. Thank you so much, and welcome for your questions or remarks.